It was a bright afternoon when the silence of my lake cabin shattered with the sound of metal grinding against the lock. And before I could even rise from my chair, Karen shoved the door open, her face twisted with arrogance as if she owned every inch of the place, stepping across the threshold without hesitation, her voice sharp as she declared the cabin now belonged to the HOA. But what she didn't know was that I had been waiting for this moment, that I had seen her circling the property, like a hawk for days, and that I wasn't alone inside, because seated calmly in the back room listening to every word was none other than the State Attorney General himself, my close ally who had come to visit that morning. And as I stood to confront her, the tension thickened, knowing Karen was about to face a truth that would crush her entire empire. My name is Anthony, and my lake cabin has always been more than just a wooden structure by the water. It was a family retreat passed down through generations, a place of peace where the sound of waves against the shore was the only noise that mattered. But peace rarely lasts when someone like Karen exists, the self-proclaimed queen of an HOA that I was never even a part of. Yet she treated me like her biggest target, sending me fake notices, threatening letters, and ridiculous claims that I owed thousands in dues to her so-called association. I laughed at her arrogance at first, brushing it off as the desperate antics of a woman who thrived on control. But Karen wasn't the type to stop. She wanted power and she wanted my cabin. And I might have let her game slide forever if she hadn't dared to cross the line by breaking into my property. That was the day everything changed. The very next morning after that unforgettable day, a crisp envelope appeared on my cabin porch, with the bold letters HOA stamped across it in red ink, and as I tore it open, my eyes fell on a ridiculous claim that I owed over $2,000 in dues for breaking neighborhood standards I was never bound by because my cabin wasn't part of her association. Yet Karen had the nerve to write that my rustic property was lowering the value of homes around the lake, that my old wooden fence was an eyesore, and that if I didn't pay immediately, she would take legal action. I almost laughed aloud at the audacity, but something deep inside told me not to discard it, so I tucked it away in a folder, deciding I would keep every scrap of evidence she threw my way. Because if I knew anything about Karen, it was that this wasn't going to stop here. And sure enough, within a week, another notice came accusing me of illegal construction, and then another claiming my dock extended too far into the water, each letter more absurd than the last, each one dressed up with fake seals and phony signatures as though she believed sheer confidence could turn lies into law. I could see her smug face behind the words, imagining me rattled and fearful. But instead of reacting, I quietly built my own case, stacking her fraud against her with every envelope I collected. And though I tried to keep calm, there was a slow burn in my chest. The anger of knowing someone was trying to erase the legacy of my family with nothing but forged papers and cheap intimidation. Yet at the same time, there was a strange satisfaction too, because I had patience, I had resolve, and most importantly, I had connections she didn't know existed. So while Karen pranced around the neighborhood spreading her venom and boasting that she would soon have me evicted, I simply waited, knowing the higher she raised herself on her false throne, the harder she would fall when the truth came crashing down. And every time I slid another one of her fake notices into my folder, I whispered to myself that the day was coming when she would regret every single letter she ever dared to send me. It didn't take long before Karen's little game sharpened into something darker, because one afternoon as the sun dropped low behind the trees, I found a thick envelope shoved halfway under my door, heavier than the flimsy notices she had sent before. And when I opened it, my hands clenched around the papers. Bold black letters screamed that I now owed over $10,000 in back dues, late fees, and penalties, all allegedly tied to rules I had never agreed to. The stamp on the top corner bore the HOA seal. But my eyes caught the sloppiness of the design, the edges uneven, the ink blotched. It was fake, but she thought I wouldn't notice. And the signature scrawled at the bottom belonged to no one real, just another creation of her arrogance. Still, she wrote with such confidence that she would seize my property, garnish my wages, even report me to the authorities if I didn't comply within 30 days. I could almost hear her voice in every line, dripping with false authority, savoring the idea of me bending under her threats. But instead of fear, I felt a deep unease. Not because I believed her words, but because I knew this wasn't just about harassing me anymore. It was becoming something calculated, something that hinted at a larger scheme she might have been running with others, And as I set the papers down, my mind raced with the possibility that I wasn't her only victim, that there were neighbors out there too afraid to question her and paying money they didn't owe, funding her greed without realizing it. The thought churned my stomach and tightened my jaw, so I took the forged letters and slid them into the folder with the rest, each page now part of a growing wall of proof against her, and I told myself that if she wanted a war of paper and ink, I would fight it on my terms. But a shadow of tension hung in the cabin because deep down I sensed this was just the beginning, that Karen wouldn't stop with threats on paper, that she was preparing to make her move in person, and though the thought of what she might try next stirred unease in my chest, it also sparked a dangerous kind of anticipation, because when she crossed that final line, I would be ready, and she wouldn't be facing me alone. The days following Karen's escalating threats brought a chilling change to the neighborhood. I began noticing the subtle shift in behavior from people I had known for years. Neighbors who once waved and stopped by for casual conversations now hurried past my cabin as if they were afraid to even glance in my direction, and whispers reached my ears when I passed by. Fragmented rumors that my property was going to be taken by the HOA, that my cabin would soon be forcibly removed, each word dripping with uncertainty and fear. And it was clear that Karen's intimidation tactics were working, her presence looming like a storm cloud over the community. One afternoon as I repaired the old wooden dock, I caught sight of her across the lake, leaning against her car with that smug grin, and she called out just loud enough for me to hear. "Soon, Anthony. You'll be kicked out. Your little retreat won't save you." And the casual confidence in her voice made my blood run cold. I could feel the weight of the invisible pressure she was applying, the slow tightening of control over a place I had considered my sanctuary for years. The isolation was unnerving, and yet as I watched her retreat, I realized that fear was a tool she wielded carefully, convincing the neighbors, convincing me that she held all the power when in reality, every move she made, every letter she sent, every whispered threat was documented, and I was preparing silently, gathering evidence, recording conversations, noting dates and times while outwardly maintaining the calm of a man who trusted his own instincts and resources. The tension in the air became almost palpable, and at night, I would lie awake listening to the distant sounds of her SUV on the gravel roads, imagining her scheming, plotting her next step, and each time I felt a surge of both apprehension and anticipation, knowing that her overconfidence would eventually become her undoing. That every whisper she spread against me only painted a clearer picture for when the time came to confront her, the community was caught in her web. But she didn't realize that patience and strategy were my allies, and that I had already begun to draw the lines that would trap her when she thought she had the upper hand. So while the world around me shifted with fear and rumor, I quietly built the foundation of a plan, knowing that the day Karen would try to execute her ultimate move against me, she would find herself facing consequences far greater than any she could have imagined, and the very whispers she spread would echo back to condemn her. The morning sun poured golden light across the lake, shimmering off the water and casting long shadows through the trees. But that beauty did nothing to ease the sudden tension that gripped me when I heard the unmistakable metallic snap of bolt cutters on my front gate. I froze in disbelief as the sound echoed against the wooden walls of my cabin, realizing instantly that Karen had come in person, audacious as ever. And there she was, striding toward the cabin with a determined glare, her hands gripping the cutters like weapons, and before I could even process my anger, the lock fell with a harsh clank to the ground, a clear declaration that nothing would stop her. I pressed myself against the far wall, heart pounding, and watched as she swung the door open, her eyes scanning the interior with smug satisfaction as if she had been invited. She stepped over the threshold, boots scuffing the polished floor, her body language screaming dominance and her voice sharp and filled with false authority, cut through the air as she declared, "This cabin belongs to the HOA now, Anthony, and you have no say in it." Every fiber of me screamed to confront her immediately, to demand she leave. But I held my ground, knowing this was part of the plan, that rushing in without control would ruin the advantage I had painstakingly built. Her arrogance filled the room, a dangerous overconfidence that I knew could be used against her. She began rifling through drawers and tossing aside papers, trying to intimidate me with the illusion of authority. And yet with each item she disturbed, I noted the evidence she unwittingly exposed. The forged documents, the notes to herself about fake fines, her own handwriting betraying her scheme. My pulse surged with both rage and excitement, because everything she did in her bold entry was another brick in the case I had already begun constructing, and I realized that while she thought she was asserting power, she was actually walking directly into the trap, and the quiet patience I had maintained for weeks now paid off, because just as I prepared to step forward and confront her, a shadow moved in the back room, and the presence of the state attorney general, calm and authoritative, filled the cabin. Karen's eyes flicked toward him, a flash of uncertainty breaking her mask, but her pride would not allow hesitation. She turned back to me, voice faltering for only a split second, and continued her charade of control, every word dripping with false confidence. Yet now it was clear that her bravado would meet the undeniable force of the law. The tension was electric. The cabin itself seemed to hold its breath as the confrontation escalated, and I felt a thrill at the knowledge that this bold, arrogant move, meant to intimidate me, had instead brought the outcome I had long been preparing for, because Karen's mistake was thinking she could barge into my home without consequences, and as she moved closer, I quietly reached for the folder of all her fake letters and notices, knowing that in the coming moments her empire of lies would unravel completely, and the daylight that shone through the cabin windows, so bright and peaceful moments ago, now illuminated the scene of reckoning that was about to unfold. Karen had no idea that every step she took inside my cabin was being witnessed and documented by both me and the most powerful ally I had ever had, and in that instant, I realized the depth of her miscalculation, the arrogance that had blinded her to the simple fact that breaking into someone's property, especially mine, would not go unanswered. And as I prepared to finally confront her, my pulse steady despite the adrenaline, I understood that this was the moment where patience, strategy, and the law converged. And Karen's bold entry, meant to assert control, had unknowingly sealed her fate, the air thick with suspense, fear, and anticipation. And every eye in the cabin, though hers was the only one moving frantically, could feel the imminent collapse of her schemes as the truth waited silently, ready to strike. I took a deep breath, feeling every muscle in my body tense as I finally rose from the chair where I had been silently observing her. And the air seemed to thicken around us as my eyes locked with Karen's, her face still twisted with that smug, self-satisfied expression. But now there was a flicker of surprise as she realized I was no longer passive. "You're trespassing in our property. Now," she spat, her voice sharp, dripping with false authority, as if the words themselves could bend reality to her favor, stepping closer with her chest out and shoulders squared, as if to assert dominance. But she had no idea that she was walking straight into the confrontation. I had been planning for weeks that I was not alone, that just a few feet behind her, calm and composed, stood the state attorney general, watching her every move with a quiet intensity that made the room feel smaller, heavier, and more charged with suspense than it had moments before. Karen's confidence wavered ever so slightly when her eyes darted to him, though she tried to hide it with a laugh, pretending this was still her victory. But I could see the cracks in her armor, and I decided to press the advantage slowly, carefully, letting her arrogance carry her forward, because the more she spoke, the more she revealed her own lies. The forged documents she thought would intimidate me, the threats she believed would crush me, all becoming evidence in her unraveling story. And I leaned forward slightly, my voice steady but filled with controlled anger. "Karen, do you really think you can break into someone's home, threaten them, and get away with it?" Her eyes widened, and for the first time the mask of superiority faltered, her mouth opening and closing as if searching for words that could somehow reverse the moment. But no words would save her now. The presence of the Attorney General made that clear. The silent authority behind him was more intimidating than any letter, any forged seal, any threat she had thrown at me over the past weeks. And as I continued to confront her, pointing out the evidence of her fabricated fines, her forged notices, and her ridiculous claims about the cabin lowering property values, I could see the color drain from her face, her posture stiffening as reality began to hit. She was not the predator in this room. She was the prey, and the sheer audacity of barging into someone's home to assert control was about to cost her everything. I watched her hands tremble slightly as she realized that every word, every action had been observed and recorded, that her empire of intimidation had a fatal weakness, and the thrill of seeing her arrogance collide with undeniable truth surged through me, the tension between us crackling like electricity, the sunlight streaming through the windows highlighting every anxious expression, every minor movement that betrayed her growing panic, and yet I held back nothing, my voice firm, my stance resolute, making it clear that this was the turning point, that the balance of power had shifted irrevocably, and as she opened her mouth to argue, the Attorney General finally stepped forward, his presence alone enough to silence her for a moment, his calm gaze fixed on her as though weighing every syllable she uttered. And in that pause, I could feel the entire confrontation crystallize, her plan, her overconfidence, her threats all collapsing in slow motion, the realization dawning that she had underestimated not just me, but the law itself, and that the very boldness that had brought her into my cabin would now be her undoing. And in that charged silence, thick with suspense and impending reckoning, I knew that Karen's arrogance would meet the full force of justice, that her empire of lies would crumble, and that the confrontation I had prepared for so meticulously was reaching its inevitable, explosive peak where truth, patience, and authority converged to bring her downfall. Just as Karen's voice rose, her words stumbling over themselves in a mix of threat and panic, the subtle sound of footsteps echoed from the back room, slow, deliberate, and impossible to ignore, and suddenly the State Attorney General stepped into view, his tall, calm presence filling the cabin like a wave of authority. Karen froze mid-step, bolt cutters still clutched in her hands, and her smug grin faltered as her eyes widened in disbelief. The air thickened instantly, tension coiling around the room like a living thing, and he looked directly at her, his expression calm but unyielding. And in that single moment, the power in the room shifted, every ounce of her arrogance collapsing. Under the weight of his gaze, he slowly took a step forward and asked in a voice both steady and chilling, "Care to repeat that?" And the effect was immediate. Karen's lips parted, then closed, then opened again, as though trying to reconstruct the bravado she had carried in moments before. But nothing sounded right. Not to me, not to him. The very walls seemed to hum. With the suspense of the confrontation, I watched her falter, her composure unraveling piece by piece, sweat appearing on her brow as she realized she had miscalculated, that I had not been alone, that she was not facing a single man she could intimidate, but two, one of whom wielded the authority of the law itself, and the look in her eyes shifted from arrogance to fear, a fleeting desperation that made her appear smaller, vulnerable. A woman caught in a trap of her own making, she tried to speak, stammering excuses about HOA rules, about dues, about her right to enter. But the Attorney General held up a hand, stopping her mid-sentence, his calm presence commanding silence, and I could see the tension ripple through her body as she realized that every step, every forged document, every illegal threat she had issued was about to be exposed. Her hands shook slightly, the bolt cutters slipping in her grip, and my pulse raced with anticipation because the scene unfolding was exactly as I had envisioned. The overconfidence that had led her to break into my home now meeting the force of consequence in real time. The air was thick with suspense as he continued to advance slowly, deliberately, each movement precise, every gesture emphasizing the inevitability of her downfall. Karen's attempts to regain composure only made the situation more dramatic, her voice now quiet and wavering as she repeated her claims. But the Attorney General simply raised an eyebrow, tilting his head slightly as if to say that her words meant nothing, that facts, evidence, and law were the only language that mattered. And in that charged atmosphere, I felt a surge of triumph, knowing that Karen's plan to intimidate me had completely backfired, that the bold entry she had executed earlier was now a glaring mistake, and the tension inside the cabin seemed to stretch like a taut wire, ready to snap. Every glance between Karen, the Attorney General, and me thick with unspoken reckoning. As he stepped closer, his presence suffocating, her excuses faltering, and I knew that she was fully aware that the game had shifted, that the predator she thought she was had become prey, and the very evidence she had tried to wield as a weapon against me now stood as proof of her audacity and deception. The sunlight, streaming through the windows highlighting the anxiety in her face, the tremor in her hands, the collapse of her false confidence. And in that moment, I could feel the full weight of justice settling over the room, the suspense reaching a crescendo, as every word, every movement, every pause became part of a perfect orchestration of exposure and revenge. And I understood fully that Karen's empire of intimidation was crumbling right before my eyes, and that the confrontation I had orchestrated with patience and precision had finally arrived, unstoppable, undeniable, and about to change everything. Karen's confident stance wavered as she opened her mouth, her words stumbling out in a rush, a mix of stammered excuses and half-formed justifications. I'm just enforcing the rules. You owe dues, and this cabin belongs to the HOA. It's within our authority. But each syllable faltered under the weight of the reality around her, and I watched her flounder, the arrogance that had propelled her here now twisting into panic, her eyes darting between me and the Attorney General, who remained calm, his expression unreadable. Yet beneath that calm lay a storm of authority and observation, and I noticed the subtle smirk tugging at his lips as he already began documenting every word, every movement, every stammering claim with his phone quietly recording, ensuring nothing would escape scrutiny. Karen's lies grew more frantic as she gestured wildly toward the cabin, insisting that I had no right to be here, that the property was part of her fabricated rules, the dues she claimed were owed, each word dripping with desperation rather than control, her attempts at intimidation collapsing under the silent judgment in the room, and I could feel the tension tighten like a coil around her, as the Attorney General's steady presence made it clear that none of her fabrications would be tolerated or ignored. Every breath she took seemed calculated to buy time, to somehow convince us that her unlawful actions were legitimate. Yet the more she spoke, the more evidence she inadvertently revealed. The forged letters, the fake notices, the timeline of her harassment all exposed in her own frantic narrative. I could see the realization dawn in her eyes that she had misjudged the situation, that breaking into my cabin had unleashed forces she could not control, and with each passing second, the room became charged with suspense, the air thick with the clash of her desperation and the undeniable authority of the law. I leaned slightly forward, voice steady but firm. Karen, every claim you just made is documented and verifiably false, and breaking into private property is a crime. And she flinched, the smirk fading from her lips, replaced with a mask of fury that barely hid the fear beneath. And yet she continued to protest, rattling off figures, dates, and regulations she had fabricated as if repeating them enough would somehow make them real. But the Attorney General's subtle nods to me, the quiet way he kept the recorder angled toward her, emphasized that truth and evidence mattered more than volume and aggression. Her panic became palpable, sweat forming at her temples, her breathing uneven, the boldness that had carried her to my doorstep now a fragile facade crumbling under scrutiny. And I could feel a mixture of triumph and tension rising, knowing that every faltering lie, every misguided attempt to assert authority, was building the case against her, the suspense wrapping around the cabin like an invisible curtain, neighbors outside perhaps oblivious to the confrontation, unaware that the arrogance they had tolerated for so long was now being dismantled step by step. And as she tried to defend herself further, pointing at imaginary rules and claiming authority that had no legal grounding, I noticed the subtle, almost imperceptible shake in her hands, the way her eyes avoided mine, flicking instead to the recorder and the calm, unwavering gaze of the Attorney General. And I realized fully that her downfall was not just imminent, it was being captured in every motion, every syllable, every desperate attempt to rewrite reality. And in that charged moment, I understood the gravity of the trap I had set, the drama unfolding exactly as I had envisioned. Every stammer, every lie, every futile justification she offered weaving the story that would expose her, dismantle her false authority, and bring the revenge we had been quietly planning into full view. And the suspense in the cabin was electric, a tangible tension that made every heartbeat and every whispered word count, as Karen's lies collapsed under the scrutiny of law, observation, and patience. And I felt the first rush of satisfaction that justice was not only coming but had already arrived. I straightened in front of Karen, the folder I had meticulously compiled over weeks of her harassment resting in my hands, and I let my eyes meet hers before slowly opening it, revealing the stack of every fake letter, every forged notice, every threatening message she had sent in her desperate attempts to intimidate me, and I watched as her confident mask shattered with the realization that every fraudulent claim was documented, every attempt at coercion captured and preserved. The weight of her panic palpable as she stepped back slightly, her voice faltering as she tried to protest, but the words caught in her throat because she now understood the magnitude of her mistake. And the Attorney General, standing calmly beside me, confirmed with a measured tone, "Anthony is correct. This is criminal behavior, and all of it is documented." His words struck like a hammer, echoing in the cabin and reverberating through the tense air. And I could see her knees buckle just slightly as the reality set in that the power she thought she wielded over me had vanished, replaced by undeniable evidence of her fraud and illegal actions. The room seemed to shrink around her as the weight of the law pressed down. Every document I slid across the table exposing her audacity, the forged signatures, the falsified dates, the attempts to create authority where none existed. Each one, a nail in the coffin of her arrogance, and I felt a rush of both adrenaline and satisfaction as she began to stammer, her words twisting into apologies that sounded hollow even to her own ears, her hands shaking as she reached for papers she thought she could explain away. But the Attorney General's calm gaze made it clear that explanation was futile, that truth had already claimed its victory, and I could sense the tension building like a storm inside her. The sheer realization that the fantasy of control she had lived in for so long was over, that every step she had taken to assert dominance had been recorded and preserved against her, and I watched her flail, trying to grasp at excuses, trying to salvage authority that had evaporated the moment I revealed the evidence. And it was as if the very walls of the cabin bore witness to her unraveling, the sunlight streaming through the windows catching the sweat on her forehead, the panic in her eyes, the tremble in her voice, while I remained calm, steady, the anticipation and suspense coiling tight within me like a spring, ready to release, knowing that every second she realized her fraud was exposed was a second closer to justice. Her breath quickened, words tripping over one another, and every gesture she made betrayed the depth of her fear, the audacity that had brought her here in person, now entirely meaningless, and I could feel the satisfaction of seeing her arrogance collide with undeniable truth. Every motion, every glance, every stammering attempt to regain composure playing out like a perfectly orchestrated revelation, and the Attorney General methodically documented every piece, ensuring that nothing she tried to spin would hold, that her empire of lies, built on intimidation and deceit, was crumbling in real time, and as I slid the last of her letters across the table, her eyes darting frantically from stack to stack, it became clear that the trap I had set with patience, strategy, and foresight was fully sprung. The suspense in the room palpable, a mixture of fear, drama, and impending consequence hanging in the air like a tangible force, and I finally allowed a small, controlled exhale, knowing that Karen's reign of lies and harassment had reached its end, that the evidence in my hands, combined with the unwavering authority of the Attorney General, left her powerless, exposed, and finally, facing the reckoning she had tried so desperately to avoid, the full weight of justice and revenge poised to crush the arrogance that had led her to break into my cabin. The sound of distant engines and the arrival of a few marked police cars drew attention quickly, and within minutes, curious neighbors began to appear along the gravel road leading to my lake cabin, their expressions a mix of confusion, concern, and awe as they tried to understand why law enforcement had come to what they had always considered a quiet, peaceful retreat. And I could see their eyes flicking toward Karen, who was now pacing frantically near the cabin, waving her arms and yelling, attempting desperately to spin the narrative, to paint herself as the victim of some imagined injustice, her voice high-pitched and frantic. Yet the more she shouted, the more the neighbors' skepticism grew, because her earlier confidence and dominance had evaporated, replaced by panic and fear. And I noticed the subtle way heads turned toward me and the Attorney General, curiosity mingling with surprise, as they observed that the situation was far from what Karen claimed, that the calm, authoritative figures inside the cabin held the truth, that her boldness had crumbled under scrutiny, and I could feel a surge of satisfaction knowing that all the whispers, rumors, and intimidation she had spread to keep neighbors in line were now dissolving in real time. The very people she had tried to manipulate were witnessing the unraveling of her lies, her frantic gestures, her desperate explanations, and her failed attempt to control the narrative. While the Attorney General methodically ensured that the facts were clear and documented, his presence a silent statement of the law's impartiality and power, and as more neighbors gathered, inching closer to see the confrontation unfold, Karen's voice grew louder, yet increasingly hollow, every accusation she hurled toward me, or the authorities sounding increasingly desperate, her narrative disintegrating under the weight of evidence, recordings, and the undeniable authority in the room. And I could see the subtle but unmistakable shift in the crowd, eyes narrowing, whispers spreading, realizing that the woman they had tolerated for so long, who had terrorized and harassed others under the guise of HOA authority, was now exposed, powerless, and visibly afraid, the suspense in the air palpable as the neighborhood watched a real-life drama unfold, each movement Karen made betraying her panic, her attempt to twist the story falling flat as onlookers began to understand the truth, that I had been prepared, that justice was not only being served but witnessed by the community she had tried to dominate, and as she continued to scream, pointing fingers and spinning tales of victimhood, I felt a calm thrill, knowing that her facade of power had collapsed, that her lies were transparent to everyone present, that her reputation, meticulously built on intimidation and deceit, was now crumbling under the combined weight of evidence, law, and witness observation, and the sunlight reflecting off the lake seemed to spotlight the entire scene, highlighting the drama, the suspense, and the stark contrast between Karen's desperation and the composed authority of the Attorney General beside me, while neighbors murmured among themselves, their curiosity now tinged with satisfaction. Seeing the bully confronted, the fraud laid bare, and the law upholding justice, the tension thick, electric, every moment stretching with anticipation, and I could sense that Karen's bold attempts to maintain control over both property and perception were failing spectacularly, that the spectacle of her unraveling lies, exposed by patience, planning, and authority, was cementing the community's awareness that she had overstepped every boundary, and in that charged atmosphere, with neighbors watching, police presence visible, and the Attorney General calmly recording and observing, I knew that the ultimate reckoning for Karen's arrogance and criminal actions had arrived, witnessed not just by the law but by the very people she had once tried to intimidate, and the suspense, drama, and vindication in the air was almost tangible. Every breath, every glance, every stammer from her a reminder of the meticulous trap she had walked right into. The tension in the air thickened as the Attorney General stepped slightly forward, holding up the meticulously organized folder of evidence for all the neighbors to see, and the sunlight glinting off the papers drew immediate attention to the forged documents, the falsified letters, the fabricated fines, and every attempt Karen had made to assert illegal authority over my cabin. And as he carefully laid them out on a nearby table, pointing to dates, signatures, and stamps that were clearly fraudulent, a collective gasp rippled through the gathering crowd, neighbors exchanging stunned glances, murmurs spreading quickly, that the very woman they had feared and tolerated, the so-called HOA authority, had been running a scam, and I could see the realization hitting Karen like a physical blow, the color draining from her face, her mouth opening and closing without sound, the bravado she had clung to moments before evaporating under the scrutiny of both law and community, and the Attorney General calmly explained each piece of evidence, highlighting the ways she had manipulated rules, forged documents, and threatened residents with imaginary fines, the neighbors leaning in, eyes widening, absorbing the full scope of the deception. And Karen's hands trembled, gripping at the bolt cutters she had brought, as if they could somehow restore her collapsing empire. But it was clear that the spell of intimidation had broken, that every whispered threat, every fabricated claim she had made over months was now fully exposed, and I could feel a mixture of vindication and tension as I watched her desperation grow, the once arrogant woman reduced to muttering half-formed excuses, stammering about rules and authority that did not exist, while the Attorney General patiently, methodically, and without emotion demonstrated how each document was false, how every claim had no legal standing, and how her actions constituted criminal behavior. And the neighbors, previously hesitant and uncertain, now nodded, their expressions a mix of shock, disbelief, and finally understanding. that Karen's reign of bullying and fraud had a tangible, documented reality that could no longer be ignored. The suspense in the cabin was palpable as Karen's eyes flicked between me, the Attorney General, and the crowd, her mind racing, realizing that the bold moves she had made, the trespassing, the forged notices, the threats, had all been recorded, witnessed, and documented, and there was nowhere left for her to hide. And as the murmurs grew louder, whispers confirming what the evidence showed, I could feel the full weight of satisfaction that justice, patience, and careful preparation had converged to bring this moment, and Karen's attempts to argue, to twist the narrative, fell flat against the clarity of truth, every paper a nail in the coffin of her lies, and her voice, once commanding and aggressive, now barely audible. Her attempts to regain composure only highlighting her panic. The neighbors leaning closer, some taking photos, others nodding in disbelief, all witnessing a live unraveling of deception and abuse, and I could feel the suspense twisting into a palpable drama, a mix of fear, shock, and triumph that made every heartbeat echo in the cabin. Karen's breathing uneven, her shoulders slumping as she realized that the power she had wielded through intimidation was meaningless in the face of evidence and law, and the Attorney General calmly continued to present, pointing to the forged dates, the fraudulent fines, the attempts to coerce me and other residents, each revelation met with murmurs, gasps, and a collective understanding of her audacity and criminal behavior. And the scene outside and inside seemed to crystallize. Neighbors staring, Karen shrinking, the law standing firm, the suspense and tension now layered with drama and vindication, and as I stepped slightly forward, observing the collapse of her lies, the full impact of preparation, patience, and strategy became apparent. Every second, a testament to the moment, when arrogance meets truth, when boldness collides with consequence, and Karen's face, pale and tight with fear, was the final, unmistakable confirmation that her empire of lies, intimidation, and forgery had been fully and publicly exposed. The neighbors witnessing the entire spectacle, the suspense still lingering, the drama reaching its peak, and the triumph of justice and careful planning resonating in every glance, every whispered comment, every silent acknowledgement that Karen's audacity had finally been met with the unstoppable force of truth and law. Karen's face was pale, her once proud stance reduced to trembling fear, as she suddenly turned on her heel and bolted toward her car, desperation fueling her every step, her eyes darting frantically as if searching for an escape that no longer existed. The weight of the evidence, the witnesses, and the Attorney General's presence pressing down on her like a physical force, and I could see the panic ripple through her body, her arms flailing slightly as she tried to push past invisible barriers of consequence. But law enforcement officers, positioned strategically around the cabin, immediately blocked her path, their calm but firm presence turning her frantic dash into a halt of inevitability. Her momentum stopped mid-stride, chest heaving, the arrogance that had propelled her through months of harassment completely evaporated, replaced with raw fear, and I felt a surge of suspense and satisfaction watching her realize that escape was impossible, that every forged document, every illegal threat, every trespass was now fully exposed and documented, and her trembling intensified as she stumbled slightly, gaze flicking between officers, neighbors, and the Attorney General, who remained composed yet unyielding, silently confirming that the law had closed in, her lips parted in a silent plea, or maybe a fleeting hope that someone, anything, could save her from the consequences of her audacity. But there was none. The cabin now a stage where truth, authority, and justice had converged to dismantle her empire of lies. And as she took another tentative step, the officers advanced slightly, guiding her back, their presence a visible wall of inevitability, the neighbors watching, some whispering, others staring in disbelief, witnessing the collapse of someone who had terrorized their community under the guise of HOA authority, and I could see the color drain further from Karen's face, her trembling hands now gripping the car door, fingers tightening in a vain attempt to reclaim control, and the suspense in the air was electric, every heartbeat echoing the drama of her downfall, every shallow breath. She took a testament to the weight of her miscalculation, and I noticed the subtle shift in her posture, shoulders sagging, head bowing slightly as reality crushed her pretensions. The once arrogant woman now fully aware that the law, the community, and meticulous preparation had cornered her completely, and I could sense the thrill of vindication rise as I observed the desperation etched into every line of her face. The futile glance toward her car, the trembling legs, the panic-stricken eyes, all revealing the stark contrast between her previous audacity and her current helplessness, while the Attorney General calmly monitored, recording and ensuring that the exposure of her fraudulent activities was complete, his presence magnifying the tension, the suspense, and the drama unfolding. As the neighbors absorbed the full picture of her downfall, the once feared HOA figure now rendered powerless, trapped by her own actions, and I could feel the satisfaction of seeing months of planning, patience, and legal strategy come to fruition, as Karen's futile attempts to flee were systematically thwarted, her trembling and shrinking form a vivid display of justice taking shape in real time. The air thick with suspense, neighbors leaning in, whispers spreading that the bold, aggressive, and fraudulent HOA authority they had feared was now finally exposed, humiliated, and restrained. And the sunlight reflecting off the lake and cabin emphasized the cinematic drama, highlighting her fear, the officer's calm precision, and the undeniable presence of the Attorney General, every detail a part of the unfolding story of revenge, exposure, and justice. And I could feel the culmination of suspense and tension reaching its peak, as Karen realized fully that running was impossible, that arrogance had been replaced with terror, and that the consequences of her lies, trespasses, and manipulations had caught up with her completely, leaving her trembling, trapped, and powerless in front of everyone she had tried to dominate. Karen's trembling escalated to full panic as officers gently but firmly guided her to the side of the cabin, the sunlight glaring down on her like a spotlight, every neighbor now watching in stunned silence as the once feared HOA authority was reduced to a vulnerable, shaking figure, and I could see the disbelief and tension etched across her face as the officers produced handcuffs, slipping them around her wrists with precision, clicking shut in broad daylight, the sound sharp and final, echoing across the cabin and the small gathering of onlookers, while neighbors instinctively pulled out their phones, capturing every moment, the suspense and drama of the arrest palpable, murmurs and whispers rippling through the crowd, confirming that the woman who had intimidated, threatened, and manipulated them for months was now powerless, her authority evaporating instantly as the handcuffs symbolized both literal and metaphorical restraint, and Karen's eyes darted between the officers, me, the Attorney General, and the neighbors, every glance betraying the stark contrast between her previous arrogance and her current humiliation, her lips parting in a silent plea that no one heeded. And I felt a surge of satisfaction as the culmination of months of harassment, forged documents, and illegal attempts to assert authority came to a dramatic, public, and undeniable conclusion, the tension thickening as the neighbors leaned closer, capturing every shudder, every defeated expression, every moment of realization that Karen's reign of intimidation had ended. The Attorney General standing calmly beside me, a steady presence that reinforced the authority of the law, while Karen's attempts to justify or explain were met with silence and the resolute presence of justice. And I noticed the subtle shaking of her shoulders, the trembling of her hands now immobilized in metal cuffs, her face drained of color, the bravado she had once wielded like a weapon now completely gone, replaced by fear, embarrassment, and disbelief, and the community around the cabin seemed to exhale collectively, witnessing the collapse of a figure who had exerted control through deception and threats, the suspense turning into cathartic release as neighbors murmured among themselves, some nodding in acknowledgement of the exposure, others exchanging glances of relief that the harassment they had silently endured was finally being addressed, and I could feel the tension and drama merge into a powerful sense of vindication as Karen was led a few steps away, every movement documented by onlookers eager to preserve the memory of this moment, every camera capturing the spectacle of authority, evidence and planning converging to neutralize someone who had overstepped every boundary, while the sunlight caught on her handcuffs, the metallic glint a stark reminder of the consequences of fraud, trespass, and intimidation, and the suspense in the air seemed almost tangible, thick with the mix of relief, shock, and awe from the neighbors, every second emphasizing the drama of the fall from power, the meticulous exposure of her lies, and the unyielding presence of law. And as Karen's steps slowed, her gaze lowered, her shoulders slumped, I felt the full weight of satisfaction knowing that months of patience, careful preparation, and legal strategy had brought us to this cinematic, high-stakes moment. The arrest itself a public spectacle of justice and revenge. Every flash of a phone camera, every whispered comment, every stunned look reinforcing that Karen's influence had crumbled, her authority nullified, and her boldness completely dismantled in front of the community she had tried to dominate, leaving her trembling, exposed, and utterly powerless. A dramatic conclusion to her attempts at intimidation. A suspenseful, emotional, and fully satisfying turning point witnessed by everyone present, with law and truth firmly prevailing over arrogance, deception, and criminal audacity. And I stood slightly back, observing the culmination of a plan executed with precision as Karen's power evaporated in real time, the suspense, drama, and triumph of justice settling over the cabin, the lake, and the gathered neighbors like a tangible, victorious presence. Weeks later, the courtroom was packed, tension hanging thick in the air as everyone awaited the proceedings, the atmosphere charged with suspense and anticipation, and I sat quietly, observing Karen enter, her confident stride now replaced with hesitant, uneven steps. The same arrogance that had carried her through months of harassment completely stripped away, and the Attorney General, commanding and composed, stood at the front, ready to prosecute, his presence alone radiating authority and control, while Karen shuffled through her papers, her eyes flicking nervously toward me, toward the jury, toward the judge, each glance betraying the panic and fear that had begun in my cabin weeks before, and now followed her into this formal arena of justice. And as the case began, the evidence I had meticulously preserved and the recordings of her lies, the forged letters and her trespasses were presented, each piece highlighted with precision, the Attorney General narrating the timeline of deceit and harassment with calm, unyielding authority, and I could see Karen's defenses crumble under the weight of truth, her attempts to spin, justify, or misrepresent events falling flat as the jury absorbed the depth of her fraud, and the suspense in the courtroom grew almost tangible. Neighbors and onlookers leaning forward, eyes fixed on the unfolding drama. Every word, every document, every photo, and every recording acting as a hammer striking against the fragile facade she had constructed. And Karen's hands trembled in her lap, her voice faltering when allowed to speak. Every sentence a stammered attempt to salvage credibility, but each one only exposed the contradictions and lies she had told, the Attorney General calmly countering each point, dismantling every claim with clarity and authority. And I felt a mixture of anticipation and satisfaction as the suspense built, knowing that the meticulous planning and documentation from my cabin confrontation had culminated in this courtroom moment, the drama unfolding like a cinematic scene, as every detail, every lie, and every act of deception was revealed to all present, and the tension was amplified with each witness called, each piece of evidence submitted, each recording played, showing Karen's arrogance, greed, and blatant disregard for the law, while the jury, neighbors, and attendees witnessed a complete unraveling of someone who had long terrorized our community. And Karen's expression shifted from defiance to panic, the color draining from her face as reality hit, the weight of inevitable consequences pressing down with every second, her once bold attempts at manipulation powerless against the structured, undeniable presentation of facts, and the courtroom itself seemed to vibrate with suspense, the drama and tension building to a crescendo as the Attorney General methodically showcased the timeline of harassment, the forged fines, the illegal break-in, and every unethical tactic she had used to intimidate me and others, while I watched silently, heart pounding, the emotions of revenge, justice, and vindication intertwining as Karen's defenses, arguments, and rationalizations collapsed. One by one, the jury's expressions shifting from curiosity to shock, disbelief, and finally acknowledgement of the truth. The suspense and drama heightened by the stark contrast between her panic and the Attorney General's composed, unwavering control. And as the closing arguments approached, I could sense the inevitability of the verdict. The meticulous documentation, evidence, and first-hand testimonies creating an unstoppable force that left Karen exposed, trembling, and defeated, and the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. The suspense almost unbearable. Every eye fixed on the scene as the culmination of months of planning, patience, and strategic revenge reached its apex. the drama fully realized, and I felt the powerful satisfaction of witnessing her carefully constructed facade collapse under the authority of law, the clarity of evidence, and the unwavering prosecution. Every second a testament to the suspense, tension, and ultimate vindication that had been building since the day she broke into my lake cabin, transforming the confrontation from a private act of revenge into a public, undeniable spectacle of justice, truth, and consequence, leaving Karen powerless, exposed, and completely undone in front of everyone she had once sought to intimidate. The courtroom held a heavy, tense silence as the judge delivered the verdict, the words echoing with finality, sentencing Karen for fraud, forgery, trespassing, and harassment, and I could see the moment the reality hit her face, her shoulders slumping, the color draining completely, her arrogance and defiance of the past months replaced by raw fear and disbelief, while the neighbors and onlookers absorbed every syllable, their expressions shifting from cautious curiosity to stunned relief as the full scope of justice settled over the room, and the Attorney General's composed presence reinforced the certainty and authority of the judgment, every detail of Karen's crimes now officially recognized and punished, her fraudulent HOA reign dismantled, the board she had controlled now under investigation, every officer, neighbor, and community member feeling the tangible weight of closure. The suspense and drama from the cabin confrontation to the courtroom now fully resolved, and as Karen was led away in handcuffs, the reality of her punishment sinking in, a wave of satisfaction, vindication, and relief swept over me, knowing that every forged letter, every illegal threat, every trespass she had committed had culminated in undeniable consequences, and the neighborhood, long oppressed by her arbitrary rules and intimidation, finally exhaled collectively, a sense of freedom and regained control washing over the community, as the power that had dominated them for months dissolved completely, and I could see the subtle but profound change in their posture and expressions, the tension easing, the murmurs of gossip turning into conversations about relief, justice, and the restoration of normalcy, while Karen, trembling and defeated, could only glance back with fleeting, desperate eyes, realizing that every act of arrogance, deceit, and criminal intent had not only been exposed but punished with the full weight of law. And I felt a profound sense of satisfaction witnessing the dramatic arc of suspense, tension, and revenge unfold into a public, undeniable triumph. The drama that had begun with her break-in at my lake cabin, reaching its climactic resolution in a courtroom and judgment that cemented the consequences of her audacity, while the Attorney General quietly ensured every procedural detail was followed, every document validated, every crime officially recognized, leaving no room for manipulation or escape, and the cinematic unfolding of justice, from the suspenseful confrontation to the courtroom drama and now sentencing, created a palpable, emotional impact. The narrative of months of harassment, intimidation, and fraud culminating in a moment where truth, law, and careful strategy overpowered arrogance and deceit. And as neighbors stepped forward, some nodding, some exchanging glances of relief, and others quietly whispering about the extraordinary events, I felt the culmination of suspense, drama, and revenge crystallize, the atmosphere charged with the satisfaction of seeing a bully completely undone, powerless, and accountable, her attempts to dominate a community now fully exposed and punished, and the cabin, once a site of tension and confrontation, now symbolized not only personal vindication, but also communal liberation. The lake reflecting sunlight over a landscape of justice served, the dramatic arc from intimidation to exposure, to courtroom suspense and finally to punishment, resonating as a story of law, patience, and unwavering pursuit of truth. Karen's face, pale and defeated, serving as a lasting reminder to all who witnessed the consequences of arrogance and deceit. The HOA board's dismantling confirming that her fraudulent schemes could no longer harm anyone, and the community, finally free from her control, could rebuild trust, security, and peace. The suspense and drama of previous events now giving way to the lasting triumph of justice, accountability, and restored order. Every neighbor, officer, and attendee internalizing the gravity and satisfaction of seeing months of harassment, lies, and intimidation conclusively punished, the narrative of revenge, exposure, and law reaching a full, dramatic, and emotionally charged resolution that, left no doubt about the power of preparation, courage, and the unwavering pursuit of justice. After the courtroom drama concluded and Karen was led away, I returned to my lake cabin with a mix of relief, triumph, and a lingering pulse of adrenaline, knowing that the months of harassment, intimidation, and fraud were finally over, and I immediately focused on restoring and reinforcing the security of the cabin, installing new locks, cameras, and alarms, making sure that no one could ever attempt to break in again. The serene waters of the lake reflecting sunlight on the freshly repaired exterior, each plank, lock, and window now symbolizing not just protection, but resilience. And as I settled back into the rhythm of peaceful days, fishing, reading, and enjoying the quiet that had once been threatened, the cabin transformed in my mind into a monument of resistance and personal victory, a tangible representation of courage, patience, and justice prevailing over arrogance and deceit, the tranquility of the lake becoming a sanctuary where I could reflect on the suspenseful, dramatic, and intense months that had brought me here, and neighbors occasionally stopping by to check in, sharing their own relief and awe at the downfall of Karen, added to the sense of communal healing. The once tense interactions now replaced by smiles, nods, and stories of collective resilience, and I found that every sunrise over the water reminded me of the persistence it took to endure her threats, the careful planning that documented every forged letter, every illegal attempt, every trespass, and every confrontation, and the presence of law, represented by the Attorney General's guidance and intervention, had turned what could have been a private nightmare into a public vindication, leaving an indelible mark on my life and the community. The cabin no longer just a family retreat, but a symbol of strength and unwavering defiance against corruption and intimidation. And as I walked along the shoreline, feeling the gentle breeze and hearing the subtle lapping of water against the dock, I could sense that the suspense, the drama, and the danger of the past months had been transformed into a narrative of empowerment, every creak of the wooden floors, every lock clicking into place, a reminder that the cabin, my sanctuary, was now fully under my control, untouchable by those who sought to manipulate or intimidate. And the days flowed with a calm, reflective rhythm, each one reinforcing the sense of freedom and triumph. Neighbors occasionally waving from a distance, the community quietly celebrating the dismantling of the oppressive HOA, and I could feel a deep, emotional satisfaction knowing that the months of careful documentation, courage, and strategic planning had secured not only my personal property, but also set a precedent, a warning to anyone who might think to exploit power for personal gain. And the cabin, surrounded by the peaceful expanse of water and trees, became a living testament to the fact that resilience, truth, and justice could overcome even the boldest arrogance. And I spent hours simply sitting on the porch, watching the sun glint across the lake, reflecting on the drama, suspense, and ultimate revenge that had unfolded, knowing that Karen's interference was permanently ended, the sense of suspense replaced by serenity, and the cabin itself now stood as a symbol, not only of personal victory but also of resistance, courage, and the triumph of patience, preparation, and the unwavering pursuit of justice. Every detail from reinforced doors to the peaceful surroundings, a reminder of the journey from harassment to vindication, from fear to empowerment, the lake shimmering as a silent witness to the complete restoration of peace, security, and freedom. And as I closed the door at night, listening to the subtle sounds of nature, I felt the deep satisfaction of knowing that my cabin, my sanctuary, and my legacy had been reclaimed, fortified, and transformed into an unassailable symbol of resilience and triumph, a cinematic conclusion to months of suspense, drama, and carefully executed revenge that now allowed me to live fully, peacefully, and without fear. Weeks after regaining peace at my cabin, I received an unexpected call from the Attorney General's office, the suspense and anticipation already making my pulse quicken as I answered. And to my shock, I learned that Karen had not just been targeting me but had been systematically harassing multiple families across the state under the guise of HOA authority. Her fraudulent schemes involving fake dues, forged documents, and threats extending far beyond our small community. And the realization hit me with a mix of disbelief, anger, and vindication that my careful documentation, recordings, and evidence from the cabin confrontation had become the key to exposing an entire statewide fraud ring, the Attorney General explaining that because of my detailed records and the confrontation captured on video, dozens of victims who had previously suffered in silence would now finally see justice, and I felt a rush of satisfaction mixed with emotional weight, knowing that my personal struggle and persistence had a ripple effect far greater than I ever imagined, the drama and suspense of the past months suddenly amplified by the scale of impact. And as I sat on the porch, the lake reflecting sunlight, like a calm witness to the unfolding revelations, I reflected on the months of tension, fear, and confrontation, realizing that every forged letter, every threat, and every trespass by Karen had contributed to a larger narrative of criminal exposure, the Attorney General detailing how investigations would now proceed across multiple counties, tracing fraudulent HOA claims, exposing illegal fines, and ensuring accountability for all involved. The suspense of discovery merging with the drama of seeing truth finally triumph on a statewide scale, and I could feel the weight of responsibility and the thrill of knowing that my actions had set a precedent, empowering others to step forward, armed with evidence and courage, to challenge abuse and corruption, and the emotional satisfaction of seeing justice extended to those previously silenced was profound. Neighbors and victims alike now gaining a voice, their experiences validated and their fears acknowledged, all because the confrontation at my lake cabin had triggered an investigation that could no longer be ignored. The cinematic arc of suspense, drama, and revenge now reaching an unprecedented scale, and as I listened to stories of families finally reclaiming their property, ending fraudulent fines, and feeling the relief of legal protection, I could see how a single act of courage and careful documentation could ignite a chain reaction, dismantling a network of lies, intimidation, and criminal behavior, and the suspense of the courtroom and the confrontation faded into a new drama, one of statewide justice, moral triumph, and the empowerment of ordinary citizens standing against abuse, the Attorney General commending my vigilance and patience, noting that my evidence was not only solid, but instrumental in pursuing multiple prosecutions, the tension and suspense now replaced with pride, relief, and awe at the reach of my actions. And as I looked out over the tranquil lake, I felt the full emotional resonance of the journey, the months of anxiety, fear, confrontation, and planning, culminating in a wave of justice that extended far beyond my own cabin, touching families, communities, and systems that Karen had attempted to manipulate, and the final twist, the realization that my personal stand had exposed a criminal network, sent chills down my spine. The drama and suspense now reframed into triumph and vindication, knowing that dozens of victims would finally see their suffering addressed, the ripple effect of truth, courage, and meticulous preparation echoing far beyond the shores of my lake cabin. And as I closed my eyes, the weight of suspense lifted, replaced by a profound sense of accomplishment. The cabin now not only a personal sanctuary and symbol of resistance, but also the origin of a statewide reckoning, a testament to the power of evidence, patience, courage, and the dramatic, suspenseful, and ultimately victorious pursuit of justice that had begun with one bold confrontation against an arrogant and deceitful HOA Karen. Karen's arrogance had finally destroyed her, the very confidence she wielded to bully, threaten, and manipulate turning into the trap that ended her reign. She had believed her fake HOA rules and forged threats could control me, intimidate me, and bend the community to her will. But she didn't know that behind my calm and measured resistance were powerful allies, including the state attorney general, and the full force of the law itself standing firmly on my side. Every forged document, every trespass, every lie meticulously recorded and ready to expose her. And as justice was served in broad daylight, witnessed by neighbors and the community she tried to dominate, the suspense, drama, and tension transformed into overwhelming vindication. Her fall a dramatic spectacle of accountability and truth, leaving the neighborhood finally free, the cabin restored, and my stand a permanent reminder that no one can underestimate someone quietly building their case, especially when the law itself is in the room, a lesson etched forever in memory.